I was recruited at the last minute to replace Ilan, that is sick. So I was asked to chair this session. I met Stan when we were both graduate students. He was a year ahead of me, and we took some courses together. But then I had the occasion, when he joined the World Bank, I had come to the World Bank a couple of years before, working with Ann Krieger. And then after the reorganization, I was running the Mexican and Central America department. And when he came, he didn't know too much about the bank. He came as the chief economist and senior vice president, and we talked a lot about the institution and so on. And then he asked me to come to work with him to run the macro department. When I joined with Ann, I was one of the economic counselors in the research department. So I knew a little about the bank. And so we worked very close together. So I learned some lessons from him from the beginning, in the sense that at the World Bank you write tons of papers and policy papers, but he brought a very important discipline. Before a policy paper was going to be written, he wanted to ask the people that were the manager of that paper, what do you want to communicate? What are your ideas? And that reduced the size of the papers substantially. So he brought a very important discipline to concentrate on what is the message that you want to back up to write the policy lesson. Then we worked together also, advising some countries together. After I left the bank, he also left the bank, coming to MIT first and so on. And then also, again we kept in very close contact. But again, when he was governor of the Central Bank of Israel, I was the governor of the Central Bank of Chile. So we would meet every second month in Basel at the meeting of the BIS. And there we worked together again because we were surprised. I was working already trying to get our work there better recognized, because we realized that we were not invited to the most important meeting. There was the discussion of the world economy that take place the first day of the meeting, because we were from small countries, Israel and Chile. So we convinced the management that we had something to say also about this of these small countries. So they changed the rules, and we were admitted, and the governors now of both banks are admitted to the BIS discussion on the world economy and so on. And then we worked a lot together after, and we wrote some papers together and so on. So I had the best from Stan, both from the point of view as a person, as a researcher, and also as a student from the same time. So what we're going to do now, we have in this session, what we're going to have also are people that have been involved one way or another in policymaking. Ilan was also the president of the Central Bank of Brazil, and now he's the president of the IDB, a very important regional bank. And Jeff has been forming a student for a long time. He was in the Council of Economic Advisors also, and so on. And Kristin also have been involved in government in the Council of Economic Advisors, but also she has done a lot of work on capital controls. And so it's something that it comes and goes. And so, but now she's going to tell us something, some of the lessons that she got from there. So we will start with Kristin, please.
Did someone take my piece of paper that was here? The sound way to keep me short. Nice. Nice try. Okay. Well, We get, yeah, 10 minutes, boom. Okay, it is an honor to be here to celebrate Stan's legacy and also to see so many other people I have learned from over decades, literally. So I realize at events like this, we are supposed to say wonderful things about the person we're commemorating, to praise their research, their contributions, fun stories. But I did worry that by the time we were at the last panel of the day, we all would have heard about all of the wonderful aspects of Stan and his wonderful contributions. So I didn't want to be repetitive. So I'm going to take a slightly different approach. Also, something a little bit more fun given this gloomy weather and this long day, and probably not what you want to do on a Saturday afternoon is sit in here and just talk about economics. So for my comments, what I'm going to do is do a top 5 list, but a top 5 of my grievances and frustrations with Stan. And don't worry, Jim, there's some economics in some of them. Okay, first, my first grievance with Stan is how I first met him. So I was deciding between several PhD programs in economics, most of which were in much better weather places than Boston and Cambridge. But in its genius, the economics department had me do a long session with Stan as I was looking at MIT. And Stan argued quite persuasively that there was no place else to go to study economics except MIT because I would get to work with him and his wonderful colleagues. So, as we all know, Stan can be very persuasive, whether you're a student, a colleague, or sit across from him as a government when he was in his IMRF role. So I quickly enrolled at MIT, showed up a few months later, so excited to take Stan's class, maybe RA or TA for him if I was lucky. And before I got there, he left and went to the IMF and never came back to MIT the whole time I was there. So I will admit, if Stan was here, he would say, I know I have apologized for the injustice I caused you for going to MIT. But in retribution, I have already given you at least one dinner. But I can't resist to just get the last word in on this one. Okay, my second grievance with Stan is that he didn't have time for a post-pandemic update of his brilliant textbook on macroeconomics. Jim already showed his copy. My copy was a little bit newer, but this was, at least in my generation when I studied economics in college, this was the Bible. This, on a personal level, this is what for me made me love economics. It took in a very simple framework. It made everything concise, so you could put structure on the world, but yet explain the biggest issues in the world. It was very impactful. And it's continued to inspire me, and I still use today in my MBA classes the ISLM model in some parts of this book, because it is just so clear, so simple, and so straightforward to get across big concepts. So I wish Stan had been around a little longer. You know, we'll forgive him that his other co-author is also unfortunately not here. But at least he did have many fantastic students who are carrying on the legacy with writing fantastic textbooks that are also easy to understand and concise in terms of expressing often complicated topics. Okay, my third grievance with Stan, and now we'll get to some economics, Jim, I promised. My third grievance with Stan is his ability to make compelling arguments, but then continually adapt them to incorporate whatever happened in the world. The flexibility that Kristin mentioned. He was quite flexible. He could convince you of something and then events unfold, and he'd have a very different argument and rationalize it incredibly well. So I thought I'd give you an example from his arguments on capital account liberalization and how to handle volatile capital flows, where he was quite impactful. So when Stan started at the IMF, he was a strong proponent of capital account liberalization. He wrote quite eloquently, quite persuasively about the benefits in terms of improving the allocation of investment, promoting growth, strengthening financial systems, et cetera, all the arguments we know well. But then after spending some time at the IMF and dealing with crises firsthand and seeing how short-term capital flows combined with open capital accounts could be destabilizing, Stan was a very early voice trying to find ways to maintain the benefits of capital account liberalization, but also mitigate the risks from volatile capital flows. He even crossed what was at the time a Rubicon in 2001 at the IMF and said, and I quote, I have cautious support for limited market-based controls on short-term inflows, such as those used by Chile right around that time. This may not sound like a big deal today, but at the time that was borderline heretical at the IMF to say something like that. And it opened the floodgate for a more serious consideration of tools such as capital controls, a debate that continued for years, that Olivier continued at the IMF years later. You could even say it culminated recently in the integrated policy framework issued by the IMF in 2020 that basically formalized many of these issues Stan was really starting to push, but did it all in a much more complicated DSGE framework. But then what I think was even more impressive and shows Stan's flexibility was that after opening this Pandora's box and after unleashing this debate, then he moved to the Bank of Israel. And in many ways, what the situation he faced at the Bank of Israel at that time was the textbook case when you should be using these types of limited controls on capital inflows, as he had started the conversation about. More specifically, from late 2008 through 2013, Israel experienced several periods of surging capital inflows that caused sharp appreciations of the currency and were threatening to undermine the competitiveness of their important export sectors. Many academics in this situation would have jumped on the case to actually use these controls that you'd started the debate on and really push thinking forward on. I mean, it really was the textbook case in a lot of ways. But Stan kept his flexibility. He listened to others, considered implementation challenges in the real world, looked at other options, and he didn't take this as a chance to prove his point as an academic by enacting capital controls, and he didn't use them at all. Instead, he shifted to a policy which he had actually argued against even more vehemently in his past and used intermittent FX intervention. Now, this again may not sound like a big deal now, but one of Stan's sort of important contributions had been to really push the argument that emerging markets had to choose from a bipolar set of options on exchange rates. He argued you either had to have a hard peg to a currency like the dollar, or like a currency board, such as Argentina, or you had to have a purely floating exchange rate. And sort of part-time intervention was the worst option. And that was based on his experience with countries that had tried that, like in the Asian financial crisis and Russian crisis, for example. But yet, despite that long literature arguing the opposite way, when Stan was at the Bank of Israel from 2008 to 2013, he didn't do capital controls. Instead, he intervened infrequently and sometimes in large amounts. So the exact opposite of what he had been arguing. And the ex post evaluation of outside academics who look at this experience generally argue is a clear success. Israel built up its reserve stockpile from about 20 to 30% of GDP, some reserves that have continued to be quite handy as Israel has faced challenge after challenge. It also reduced appreciation pressures on the exchange rate. Some estimate between 5 to 10%, and that helped exporters, kept exporters competitive. And it also offset potential Dutch disease effects. As Israel had then expanded its, or discovered natural gas, there was a real risk that could have choked off the competitiveness of other sectors. And this intervention maintained the competitiveness of other sectors. So, and he avoided some of the stigma that happened with other countries that use capital controls. So very gutsy of him, also very candid, to really look at the situation in hand, even then make decisions that might have contradicted some of his academic writings. So this debate on how countries should respond to volatile capital inflows continues today. We may talk about it on the panel. A number of other countries, when Stan chose not to use controls, a number of other countries did, such as Brazil. I'm not sure if Ilan has views on this, Colombia, Thailand, Indonesia. But my read of the academic literature on these other countries that did choose capital controls was it was not as successful as Stan's approach for Israel. And fast forward to recently, we've been through a pretty volatile few years. And let's look at what countries have done. Have they followed Stan's approach or other approaches and used capital controls? The evidence is pretty clear most have followed Stan's approach. He really did blaze the way in how you handle these experiences. Look at around the pandemic 2020 and then the sharp recovery afterwards when there's a sharp surge of inflows into emerging markets. During this window, most or a large number of countries used FX intervention and a whole host of other tools. Almost none touched capital controls through these ups and downs. And then even this year, in the past few months, as winter war in Iran, and we have seen markets bounce up and down and capital surge in and out of emerging markets based on news announced via tweets in 280 characters or less. What are countries doing? They are not resorting to capital controls, but a number are using FX intervention, including some advanced economies. So the bottom line, I think huge credit should go to Stan for pushing us to think about these different issues, think about the different risks, put forward ideas, and then be flexible as the world evolves. Think about implementation challenges. And the strategy he landed on in Israel was the one that does seem to be the best practice around countries around the world today. Fourth grievance with Stan is that he left Washington too soon. His expertise and his vocal support for using macroprudential regulation to actively build buffers during good times has been sorely missed over the last few years. So we haven't yet talked at this conference about all of Stan's contributions in terms of macroprudential regulation. We heard about some of the more micro regulation from Ben in the last panel. But for those of you who don't know this line of his work, Stan was an early and vocal advocate of the importance of macroprudential regulation. And he started to argue this well before it was the hot topic that everyone has, the last few years focused on. He continually argued that the combination of modern financial systems and global capital flows requires building strong buffers during good times. Now, to be fair, the US and a lot of other countries have learned this lesson. They have built up buffers since the 2008 financial crisis and made good progress, but especially during the 2010s when Stan was in Washington. But since then, since 2021, progress has definitely slowed, particularly in the US. And not just coincidentally, maybe, since Stan left DC. If anything, movement on macroprudential regulation in the US has recently been in the opposite direction. Despite the fastest economic recovery on record, inflation at levels we haven't seen since the 1970s and 1980s, and a stock market that regularly reaches record highs, and spread of financial intermediation outside the banking system. So in many ways, this is the case when you should be building macroprudential buffers. But what's disconcerting is most of the world actually is doing that. If you look around the world, let's take the CCYB, the countercyclical capital buffer. This is one of the sort of standard tools of macroprudential management. Number of countries have them in place. The logic is very straightforward. You build the buffers during good times to slow the excessive expansion of credit. You release the buffers during recessions or crises to help support lending. So economics, again, straightforward. I don't know any economists who disagree with this as a general approach that should help and should be a useful buffer. And since 2022, as economies recovered very quickly, lending came back, markets have bounced back, many countries around the world have raised their CCYB, their contingent buffer. Just to name a few, the UK, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, Netherlands, Ireland, Denmark, you get the picture. A lot of countries are doing that. But one country I didn't name was the US. Really stands out. The CCYB has remained at zero in the US since it was put in place, including since 2021, when most other countries have raised their buffers. And it's not like the US has underperformed any of these countries in terms of growth, in terms of equity markets, pick your favorite measure. Just shows that the US is not building buffers the same way these other countries are with this just very simple, basic tool. And I can't help but wonder if Stan was still at the Fed, if he could have used his years of experience dealing with the aftermath when countries don't build their buffers in good times, if he could have persuaded a few people to actually think about this and take it seriously and maybe even raise it. I don't even hear much discussion of it today. Last, my fifth and my final grievance with Stan is that he could regularly humble all of us who think we are in good physical shape. One of the wonderful traditions I had with Stan was that when we were at conferences, we would often go on a run on the sidelines in these lovely locations. And it seemed like it wasn't that long ago. We were just in Sintra, Portugal. And for those of you who know Sintra, this is not an easy place to go running. The hills are super steep. The wind blows viciously against you. I I swear, in both directions. No matter where you go, the wind's against you. And you have to run with your badge around your neck that's constantly hitting you or slipping out of your hand, or you'll get jumped by the security guards that are hiding in all the bushes. So this is not an easy place to run at any age. And I remember the last year I was there with Stan, I was ready to just skip the run and go sit by the pool. It had been a long day, but Stan would not have it. And not only did he drag me out for a run, but he managed to chat the whole time while we were trying to get up those big hills. Although, come to think of it, I think Stan probably asked me a bunch of really short questions that I had to answer with lots of long answers as I huffed and puffed. But, again, he was very skilled at a whole range of abilities. But nonetheless, we did the loop and we finished, and he had that smile, that wry smile on his face that we all know and love, and that twinkle in his eye. It was really impressive. And thinking back, that was typical Stan. That's one of my last memories of him. He would always push you to be better, not just intellectually, but in all aspects of his life. And he always did it with a smile. So Stan, if you're out there somewhere listening, I've now aired all my grievances. Thank you. And I'll hand the floor over to Ilan. Oh, sorry, to Jeff.
Oh, Jeff. Yeah. Now Jeff.
Thank you. I have, late in the day, added an anecdote since everyone's giving them, and I've also added slides. With apologies to my fellow panelists, we said we weren't going to do slides. This anecdote, Stan was such a Superman, did everything, that it's sometimes hard to remember that in the 70s, when many of them had him as a professor, that he was in the ivory tower pretty completely. He didn't have much policy interaction. So the anecdote I want to tell is my perception of when that changed in the fall of 1983. He wrote a NBR working paper on the economy of Israel. And back then it was possible to read all the NBR working papers in your field. So I read it. And that same month, I went to Washington and started working on the staff of the CEA for Marty Feldstein. Very soon, George Shultz, the State Department, said we were going to put together a team to visit Israel, to do what the IMF would do if it was another country. They were in hyperinflation at the time. The group is called the JED, Joint Economic Development Group. I don't know if this is the same episode that Bill was talking about, Bill English. Ben Bernanke, I bet, remembers the later version of this group. It always includes one outside member out of the government. And I put in Stan's name knowing that he had written this paper, and they offered it to him. And he told me that at first he was going to turn it down, that he wasn't comfortable leaving the ivory tower, wasn't entirely comfortable leaving it, for what I think was the first time. I mean, people can correct me if I've got any of this wrong. But he went down the hall and talked to someone. I think it was the dean of Sloan. And he told, is that Abe Siegel? Anybody who knows. He told them, if the president asks you to do something, serve on a group, you do it. And so he did. And he was great at it. And after that, he got more and more into policy. So I think that was a transition, the first time he crossed that barrier. I'm going to talk about two things: fixed versus floating exchange rates and liberalization of capital controls. Kristin talked about both, especially liberalization of capital controls, so I won't say as much about that. I'm doing as a jumping off point some papers, some things that Stan wrote. First, fixed versus floating rates. In a conference paper with Rudy in 1986, he wrote that supporters of floating at the time of the Bretton Woods breakdown, and that included most economists, believed a shift to floating rates would enable insulation, enable them to be insulated from foreign disturbances. That did not happen. They give two reasons in this: the dominance of supply shocks in the 1970s, which was not foreseen, and that's clearly right. You can't. Exchange rate regime is not going to save you from an oil shock or other supply shock. Oil shocks of 74 and 80. Of course, we have another one now, and if the world goes into recession, that'll be another example. And examples of supply shocks that are not oil shocks would be the pandemic in 2020, and I would say the Trump trade war. Besides supply shocks, Stan and Rudy found the same failure of floating to insulate national economies that it applies to demand shocks. Quote, a second reason is that with different speeds of adjustment of assets and goods markets, you get the wrong answer. I don't think I agree. It's sort of sacrilege to say that, and Kristin has talked about a number of issues on which Stan evolved, and I think this was one of them. I'm also talking about the two papers he wrote on the corners hypothesis. He called it the bipolar view. It was very popular at the time in the aftermath of the East Asia crisis. The corners hypothesis says, as Kristin mentioned, that intermediate exchange rate regimes are no longer viable. The countries need to move to the corners of either, actually, I think I've got the impossible trinity here. So everything I'm saying fits into the framework of the impossible trinity. Impossible trinity, of course, says that we would like to have financial integration, other things equal. We would like to have exchange rate stability, other things equal. We'd like to have monetary independence, meaning the ability to set your own monetary policy following your own domestic conditions without having to accept the monetary policy of the world or of the United States. I'm going to give a couple of examples where it looks like floating failed to insulate countries. My first is Brazil, and Ilan can correct me if I've got this wrong. In 2010, Finance Minister Montega accused the U.S. and other advanced countries of waging a currency war, that they were easing monetary policy, which of course they were under quantitative easing, and that this was putting pressure on emerging market countries like Brazil as a flood of money. Actually, next year, President Dilma Rousseff criticized quantitative easing, which is our friend Ben Bernanke at the time, as causing a monetary tsunami. And then the second example is of transmission, apparently, the taper tantrum of 2013. Quantitative easing would soon be phased out. Ben testified. Long-term interest rates rose. That provoked a complaint from the Indian central bank governor, Raghu Rajan. And let me also mention Helene Ray, who gotten a lot of attention for a paper 10 years ago. They said it floated, dilemma, not trilemma. The trilemma, the impossible trinity is an illusion, and floating cannot insulate from international policy. So that's the background on which I'm giving these incidents. Empirical studies do show that if the U.S. raises interest rates, what happens in other countries depends on its exchange rate regime. If it's pegged, it suffers a fall in growth. And if it's floating, it does not. So that particular study is by D. Giovanni and Shambaugh, but there are others, which I think cast doubt on this hypothesis. Of course, disturbances are transmitted if capital is mobile, but if they float, it's not saying you don't feel any effect from, let's say, a U.S. monetary stimulus or contraction. There is some impact, but you have the ability under floating to adjust your domestic policies to offset it and leave you at the same desired point where you were before in terms of aggregate demand, in terms of the trade-off between output and inflation. If Brazil didn't like the inflationary effect of quantitative easing in 2010, it could have chosen not to allow stimulus and instead allow appreciation, which is largely what it did. Similarly, if India did not like the contractionary US taper in 2013, it could have chosen not to let its interest rate rise and instead allow depreciation, which is also what it did. So my conclusion, my view is that financial integration does not force countries to choose between firm fix and free float. It's true that if you have financial integration, open capital mobility, you can't have both exchange rate stability and monetary independence. But there's nothing that says you can't have half and half. Intermediate regimes like a target zone put you on the bottom, if you have full financial integration, put you on the bottom segment. And they're perfectly viable in theory. There's proven theories of target zones going back to that. And I would say that that's what has happened for most major emerging market countries. They're following intermediate regimes. According to classifications, the IMFs and others, very roughly half the countries are following intermediate regimes, a quarter are pegging, and a quarter are floating, very rough round numbers. Here's a study I mentioned by Giovanni and Shambaugh, where the peggers suffer a loss of growth when the US raises interest rates and the non-peggers do not. And the difference is statistically significant. Okay, I'm going to conclude. Well, actually, I have to say a bit about capital controls. I want to show the two episodes. First, the quantitative easing in 2010 and how different countries in Asia responded. They all face this tsunami of monetary ease coming from the US, and they reacted in different ways. The horizontal axis is appreciation against the US dollar, and the vertical axis is reserve accumulation. So Korea mostly absorbed reserves, increased reserves, and didn't allow that much appreciation. India, on the other hand, took it entirely in the form of appreciation. And Malaysia almost as much, and not in terms of increase in reserves. So they were taking advantage of the exchange rate flexibility to insulate their economy from the US monetary policy. Different countries can choose a different degree of how aggressively they manage their floating. Now the taper tantrum, May to August 2013. May is, I think, when Ben testified that by the end of the year there would be a tapering of quantitative easing. U.S. long-term interest rates rose. Different countries reacted with different degrees of intervention. So Singapore intervened heavily, while India and the Philippines mostly depreciated. They each chose how much they wanted to absorb of the exchange market pressure in the form of depreciation versus in the form of reserve loss. So let's see, I guess on capital controls, maybe I don't have much to say after past what Kristin said. Stan got kind of lucky. He gave a speech in 1997 at the annual meetings in Hong Kong where he said, capital controls are a goal that the countries should move towards. And the interim committee, under his influence, I think, tried to change the Articles of Agreement to say that free capital movements were a core value, a core target for the IMF. Bad timing, the Asia financial crisis hit exactly the same time and, of course, spread to other countries in 97, 98. And he did reverse himself, and the IMF reversed themselves. Besides giving credit to Stan, I think I'd give credit to Stan's students who were chief economists at the IMF, Ken Rogoff, Olivier, Raghu Rajan, and who am I missing? Somebody. The research department produced studies finding that the capital controls weren't so bad after all. And maybe that's got something to do with the fact that the strong increase in capital integration that's gone on throughout the post-1970s period, peaked in 2008. Of course, the global financial crisis was the other object lesson that influenced the policy. And by various measures, financial market integration has not increased. It maybe even decreased a little since 2007. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Your floor.
I'm taking my paper. So, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Some of you have studied, and I'm very glad to see the family of Stan Fischer here. I am the last panelist in the last panel before the rest of the program. And I think that's appropriate because I think I was the last student, last advisee of Stan Fischer. I don't know if you did it in purpose, but that fits very, very well. So let me tell you when I first met Stan. I was an undergraduate student in Brazil. In Brazil, the professors will never call the students to ask them to go to graduate schools. Stan Fischer was still a textbook, the Bible that Kristin mentioned, Dornbusch and Fischer. And somebody called me and said, well, there is somebody called Stan Fischer who will call you in 5 minutes. I say, that's a prank. What are they doing? Who's the other side? And the other side was somebody that says, this is Stan Fischer, is this Ilan? And that shows to me how unpretentious he was, how he was more about substance. And that's actually what followed him in places like the IMF. When I was at the IMF, Stan is known to be very humble and very respectful of everybody. Any question, there's no stupid question, there's no simple question. They're all questions that he will take very careful and will answer. So people really felt absorbed and really felt a family at the IMF when he was the deputy managing director. We believe that today, talking about the multilateral banks, and I think I can talk a little bit about that. That was an important part of Stan's work. First, the World Bank, then at the IMF. And I would like Stan to be here to help us respond to a very important question. In a fragmented world where extremes dominate, where debates happen in bubbles, where multilateralism is hard to sustain, to maintain, where public goods or the corporation seems not to be seen as very good answers to the elected officials. I tend to talk to authorities where they increasingly ask me, how can I explain what we are doing there for my constituency? And the explanation that there's a public good that benefits all and that will reflect on them is too far away, it's too indirect. I want arguments that will tell me how it will improve for my companies immediately, and that is, I think, the threat that we're facing today. It is not about institutions disappearing, not even the composition changing. I think the US will be there, everybody will be there, but the way you approach is, I think, under very different ways. And I think Stan had the right answer in his farewell at the IMF. He said we should not be passive observers of problems that arise. The institutions should be active to work towards what we believe is correct. At that time, and still market-oriented policies, a global economy that works together. And he himself not only commented on the system, he actually helped to build it. I will say there are 4 areas where I believe he will have and he will contribute. First, on credibility and the institutions. On credibility, he understood that to have influence, institutions have to be credible and independent. And to be that, you need to be more transparent. He will argue that not only because it provides more information to the markets, and at the IMF it's known that the IMF has changed quite a bit after and before and after Stan. Things become more public, you get more information. But he says it's not only because it provides more information to the public, to the markets, but even more because it puts constraints on what policymakers can actually do. And that insight shaped the IMF in the late 1990s when the institution became more transparent about its surveillance of programs. And independence was inseparable from accountability. Independence must also always be accompanied by responsibility and appropriate checks and balances. That's how he started at the Bank of Israel, when the independence of Bank of Israel actually consolidated under Stan Fischer. However, he also said that credibility and independence in turn is only sustained through the quality of the decisions institutions make. So good decisions over time are the real sustain of credibility and independence. Another point that he will have made is that we need to think about policy making in a very rigorous way. Thinking policymaker in a rigor meant first for Stan that policymaking was never automatic, was never just passive. It was a system that had to be actively managed all the time. That required policymakers to be intentional, not passive, in how they approach shocks, institutions, and integration in the global economy. It also required pragmatism. When I was at the IMF during the Asian financial crisis, I was a very junior, and I was thrown into the Asian crisis in Indonesia. I saw that he treated all these crises, the Asian crisis, not as abstract models or purely analytical exercise. He believed that the theories are a good guide to what is analytical possible, but you have to look at what has actually happened when different governments have tried to implement these measures to understand what you should recommend as opposed to what is analytically a possibility. Today we will call it evidence-based institutions, look at the evidence and really work your policy based on what actually works. And what actually works sometimes depends on constraints. Constraints that are economically, politically, and socially. And that is also important to have ownership, the other part, because constraints sometimes depend on how you own the policy. You could say, I'm very constrained politically, I'm very constrained socially, there's nothing I can do, just give me the money. Ownership means that these constraints can be dependent, somehow endogenous to how you own the policy. Last, I want to argue what will Stan say in this last shock. We have a shock, Iran shock, a world shock, and we have now to deal with how do we respond to that. And I don't think this shock is completely different from the rest, but it's the latest example. And I remember 80s and 90s, Brazil, Mexico, others, Latin America, all these shocks. It's not the same, but we are in a world of sequential shocks, and I think we need to deal with it in that way. I think we should think about the reaction in three ways, and I would like to think that Stan will think about it in that way. First, this shock is not a small shock. It's not something that you could just put your resources and have enough resources to do that. It's a shock that needs focus. Countries have very large debt today, emerging markets in particular also. So you need to concentrate on protecting the most vulnerable and be very targeted. And that is, I think, where the comparative advantage of a development bank like the Inter-American Development Bank can work, is how to target, how to do it in a way which is not, will not affect you in the long run. Second, this shock will not end immediately. it will take some time. If you look at prices of oil future, it's not coming back so soon. So it means that the call for more liquidity, more money, big packages is something that you need to take very carefully. It doesn't mean that you don't need to provide some liquidity, but have to realize that the first call should be do no harm. And do no harm means that if you increase the debts, if you do some non-targeted help, it will actually mean that at the end of the day, you make countries worse. And last but not least, I will say, Stan will probably mention that you should not waste a crisis. Do medium and long-term policies, reforms, diversify, reform your economy, make it less vulnerable. In the case of Latin America, can you produce more fertilizers? Which you don't have. If you are agro-business economy, you don't have fertilizers, you have a big problem, even if you are an oil exporter. Things like that, you need to work in the moment of crisis, because this is the moment where you actually have the leverage to do it. So let me conclude saying the big question is how we can sustain multilateralism in the way that people actually look at it in a way. So my answer is an answer that I believe Stan will have. Dialogue is often built inside institutions. We have the ingredients. We need to know how to do the dish. We have the boards inside the institutions. We have the governors there. We have the multilateral development banks, the UN system. They contain rules, frameworks, and channels for cooperation. So the task is not to invent new structures. It's actually to keep the ones that exist functioning. And real dialogue is not always elegant. It is messy. It involves disagreements. It requires countries and institutions to remain engaged, even when views really diverge. Think about your WhatsApp group. You really want to get out when everybody's in the other side. Stay there, because the relationship still matters. So progress rarely comes from perfect alignment. It usually comes from what's practical, achievable, and capable of producing results. We do not need unanimity. What we really need are coalitions willing to cooperate, where interests align and outcomes can be delivered. So I'm very grateful to Stan. I'm grateful to all of you for being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I just will make a couple of more points because of also of the time. First, also in this interest of Stan building institutions, he played a central role in the case of the Bank of Israel. Also, when he arrived there, monetary policy was made by the president of the central bank. That was all. So he realized that he needed to have a committee. So he convinced the prime minister to have a committee. So it was a board from there on that will make the decision, because one person can make mistake. You need to have different views. So that reveals very much. Because most of the people will say, better I run it by myself. I don't need this board that bothered me a lot. I was the chairman for 5 years, so many times maybe I had that regret. But at the end, I think that it's very important to have the opportunity to have other views and to discuss the views and to have an informed decision. And I think that it worked much better in that way. And in his case, he was the one that convinced. Also, when he came to the bank, he helped to build a very strong institution, thanks to bringing different people, listening to people, and so on. On capital control, I will say, in the case of Chile, I was the chairman for 5 years of the bank. We never used capital control. What we did is that we developed a system in such a way that the risks were well measured. A commercial bank has to evaluate when they take open position. They have to have enough protection there. So we put the macro in order. So we have inflation targeting, a well-regulated and supervised banking system, and we never, but we're very important at the beginning. because at the beginning, when the transition to democracy came, this model that was developed under dictatorship was sustained in time, so there was a lot of interest on investing in Chile. So there was going to be a big real exchange rate appreciation with this capital inflow coming in. So it played a substantial role, the capital control in the initial year. But when we graduated from that, we were able to live without any problem. Even the 5 years I was the chairman, from 2003 to 2007, we never intervened in the exchange rate market one day. We didn't need it because the market was functioning. So the exchange rate, the best way to protect yourself was to have some flexibility in the system. If the price of copper go up, then the exchange rate will appreciate. But everybody knew that, so there could be financial contract that will smooth that. And that worked fantastically. And never again we have intervened in the system, never. The only, and when the central bank in one moment decide that there is something that maybe one market is not functioning or whatever, any intervention from the point of view of reserve accumulation is announced in advance and is fulfilled up then. So we graduated. So from there I learned that to have the macro in order, good supervision, good regulation is the best long-term protection. But it has an important role when there are shock in the short run or there is force for appreciation or whatever.
They asked me about Brazil. I forgot to answer.
I'm sorry?
They asked me about if Brazil controls work, both Jeff and Kristin. They didn't work at all, not even at the beginning. So that's why for the last decades, they gave up on that.
We're going to exactly. So I would say that so that was my comment on that. Yeah, so